I've never considered myself a nosy person. No more nosy than the next guy. I just have what my ma would call an unhealthy amount of curiosity. I was the kid who climbed to the top of the big oak in the backyard just to see what was in the crow's nest. I was the kid who dug a hole in the backyard, so deep that I hit groundwater, because I was convinced there was a cave under our house, and I wanted to see it. To see. My folks aren't dirt poor, but they're pretty close. They're part of that missing middle of Britain, the people who work 40 hours a week until they die, with no savings to speak of. I got my first job at a horse stable when I was 14. It didn't last very long. I knew I needed to get a job because I knew we needed the money. So I bounced around for the next few years, washing dishes, waiting tables, until I graduated high school. Dad was really tough on me about university. He never went. No one in his family did. So there were a few fights about where I'd go after school. It was a huge shock to me when just after graduation, he drove me down to the uni. He'd been classmates with the dean, and they'd come up with an arrangement where I get a full scholarship, provided I made good grades and worked for the university. I never felt like a scholar. In high school, I kept my head down and did enough to get by, pulling off a few B's and a few C's. I wasn't interested in learning, because learning wasn't interesting. Uni was different. I took mainly core classes: mathematics, English, history, science, but they were fascinating. For one thing, no one cared if I showed up or not. It was entirely up to me to succeed, so I did. In exchange for my education, I worked security and did some light maintenance duties. Maintenance was a no-brainer. I've always been handy, and most of the fix-it jobs were the type that could be solved with a liberal application of WD-40 or elbow grease, or both. Security was a different story. Security gave me superpowers. The job itself was pretty easy. I got a uniform, a badge, a flashlight, and Mum gave me some keychain mace for my birthday. I worked mostly nights and weekends, and doubles during long holiday breaks. I was to walk around the full campus twice a night, checking the labs, computer centre and library. The rest of my time was pretty much my own. There were 2 other guards, Jake and Al, but they worked different shifts from me. We had overlap nights on Wednesday nights, where we get together for about an hour to discuss any major events or changes. There might have been some beer at those meetings, but I'm underage, and you can't prove anything. Jake worked mostly day shift, and Al worked swings and some overnights during the week. Jake was a younger guy, training to be on the local police force, so he took his job pretty seriously. On the other hand, I'm pretty sure Al mostly slept during his shifts. Al was 2 years older than dirt, so he deserved his rest. Remember that bit about superpowers? My first night on the job, Al gave me a huge keychain with about 1,000 keys on it. It weighed nearly 5 pounds and was secured to my belt with a heavy-duty metal chain. "Don't lose that keychain, kid," Al said. "You got the keys to the kingdom right there. Any door that don't open, you don't want to go in it." My work hobby, the thing that kept me awake on those long, cold winter break nights, was exploring. I made it a point, every night, to open a door that I'd never opened before. I started in the new section, where the library and computer centre were, opening each room, each closet, making a map in my head of where everything was. Some nights, I might have explored 2 or 3 rooms. Other nights, I might not have had time for anything more than an odd, out-of-the-way broom closet. The uni's actually a pretty large campus for having a full student body of only 12 or 1300. It was built in 1896 and became government-owned in the 30s. There were 3 main sections. The old school housed the administration offices and a few unlucky classrooms. Unlucky due to the lack of central heating and air. And the 3-story building had no elevators. The labs were a brutalist horror of poured concrete slabs and tiny windows. Built back in the 70s, when buildings that looked like Soviet radiators were in style. The new library was steadily losing its new, built in the late 90s boom, and made in that unique red brick and glass style, like everything else during those years. When I think back to those early days, those days before, I think how stupid I was, how naive. I should have thought about winter. I should have thought about the solstice. By December of my second year at uni, I'd cleared every room in the new library. I'd opened every door, checked every closet, and had a good mental map of the whole building. It was, ultimately, pretty unimpressive. I found no buried treasure, no secret stash of missing computer supplies, cached in a forgotten closet. December's a slow time for the uni. After the mad rush of finals, the campus was suddenly deserted, the remaining few staff seemingly lost. The building stood silent and dark in the thin winter breezes. We had a steady series of snowstorms, but none bad enough to close the campus. I made sure the pavements were clear and the entryways salted, but otherwise tried to stay indoors. Besides, I had the old school to explore. The main old school building, Downing Hall, was a 4-story V-shaped building. It had no elevators, tiny stairwells, and was only exempted from health and safety rules due to its historical importance. It had no air conditioning, save for sporadic window mount units that were only permitted to be installed on the rear of the building, so as not to spoil the building's historic charm. The building's heat came from a massive, ancient boiler in the basement. As far as I knew, Al was the only person who knew anything about the boiler, and he must have kept it in good shape, because I never heard of any complaints about it. I spent the second week after finals poking through the top floors of Downing Hall. I didn't have a lot of time for exploring every night, as the snow gave me more than usual upkeep chores, but I made steady progress. I discovered a small room in the attic on the left wing that must have been an old dean's office, complete with a beautiful antique desk and wardrobe. I checked both, thinking I might find something historic to give to the dean, but the wardrobe was empty, save for a moth-eaten wool scarf. And the desk's contents were limited to a few old newspapers and some tax forms from the 50s. A level below, on the building's 4th floor, I found 24 small, empty classrooms. In my handyman mindset, I checked the windows for loose glass panes and for water or rodent damage. I fully expected to see some rat droppings, or at least some insect damage, but I found none. The 2nd and 3rd floors were much the same, except the rooms on the rear of the building were air-conditioned, and therefore actively used for classes when school was in session. The main floor was administration and included the dean's office. I thought it wise not to snoop around in my boss's office or in payroll, so I skipped a lot of these rooms. I made my way to the stairwell to the basement, used my superhero keychain, opened the heavy door, and went down. The basement of Downing Hall was different to that of the new library. For one thing, it was a lot more cramped. The hallway was narrow and the ceiling was low, with doorways leading off at regular intervals. I checked every room, flipping the old 2-button switches to on, using my flashlight on the dark corners. I carried a few packs of spare light bulbs in my satchel, thinking to replace any that had burned out and save the environment while I was at it. The little rooms mostly contained junk, spare desks, filing cabinets full of 40 and 50-year-old papers, old holiday decorations, and so forth, lit by naked hanging bulbs. I'm not an imaginative kind of guy. I guess I'm pretty smart. I'd made straight A's in my college courses. It had never occurred to me to be scared. I didn't think, I'm alone in a creepy old basement. This was my place, my job, my hobby, and it all seemed so normal. By the night of the 20th of December, I'd made my way to the boiler room. The furnace was a massive monstrosity of iron and rivets, pipes and gauges. It was hellishly hot in that room, and equally loud. It was, however, neat and very clean. Al kept it that way, because he said a clean boiler lets you get more shut-eye. The furnace had been converted from coal to gas at some point, but the soot had stained the walls of the room, and the old coal chute still opened in one of the corners. I had no intention of giving the boiler room more than a glance. I'd been there dozens of times, and there was nothing to see, just a workbench and the furnace itself, when I noticed a small door to the back and left behind the furnace. That's weird, I thought to myself. I'd never seen that door before. But then again, I'd never stood in that particular spot beside the workbench, and I'd never really looked. The door was smaller than a normal door, maybe 5 feet tall, painted in the same non-colour, drab grey-brown of the walls, and was made of metal, just like the other doors in the basement. I went over to it and touched the handle. I think the body knows, sometimes, when things are wrong. Have you ever had that feeling, like you're being watched? When you know that you're totally alone, and no one can see you, but you feel eyes on you. Have you ever gone left instead of right, because you got a feeling that you just shouldn't go to the right today? It didn't work that way for me. When I touched that doorknob, nothing felt any different. My head didn't hurt, my neck hairs didn't stand up, and I didn't hear an inner voice saying, "Don't do it." The doorknob turned, but the door wouldn't open. I looked more closely and saw a small keyhole. I checked my magic keychain and found 3 possible matches. Struck out on the first 2, and the third worked, of course. Of course. The hinges squealed like they hadn't been used in a long time. I'm talking decades. My handyman instincts noted it. WD-40, I mumbled. I hauled open the door and stepped through, into another small, cramped hallway. The light switch worked, and the single bulb blew with a crack. Damn it! My hackles did raise then, I flicked on my flashlight and quickly swapped out the hallway bulb with a new one. I looked around and saw that this hallway was narrow, straight, and ended a few yards away at another door. That door opened easily onto another stairway. "What the hell?" I said. No one had ever mentioned a sub-basement for this building. The hairs on the back of my neck were still standing up. I shook it off as nerves from the blown bulb and walked to the stairwell. It was a standard stairwell and looked pretty much the same as the others in the building. I walked to the bottom and met another door. I pushed through it to see another long, narrow hallway, with doors leading off to either side at regular intervals. The first door to my left was unlocked and opened fairly easily onto a storage closet. There were stacks of late 60s era books, a few desks, and a decaying mop in its bucket. The door across from that was unlocked, but didn't open so easily. I hauled the door open to find a larger room that looked to have been used as a classroom. There were desks, a blackboard, anatomical diagrams, and posters on the walls. Everything was covered in an inch of dust and appeared to have not been touched in a long time. "Why would anyone put a classroom down here?" I mumbled to myself. "How are they even convinced students to get down here in the first place?" I remember thinking, at that point, that I must have somehow discovered a back way into the other wing of the V-shaped Downing Hall. Maybe this is where the old science classes were held, before the labs were built. I moved on to the next set of rooms. They were both classrooms, abandoned, dust-covered, and mostly empty. So were the next pair, and the next. I saw a total of 12 disused classrooms in that hallway, and a small break room, complete with a lonely coffee pot. I also found 2 small restrooms. I didn't spend much time checking them out, as the lights didn't work, and I didn't feel like replacing those bulbs. I found myself getting slightly nervous. I was in a strange section of the campus, and I was working alone that night. In the back of my mind, I just couldn't truly justify the existence, the waste, of a whole floor of unused classrooms. When I got to the end of the hallway, I met another steel door. I opened it and saw another stairwell. I was fully expecting this stairwell to go up, to connect to one of the other main stairwells in Downing Hall. To my surprise, the stairs only went down. This was the point, I remember, at which I began to get scared. No way. There's no way these stairs go down. How would anyone get down here? The stairwell echoed that last word back at me. I should have checked the time. I should have been concerned with finishing my rounds. I should have been hungry for lunch. I should have run. I started to climb down the stairs. This stairwell was unlit and appeared to be much older and in a much worse condition than the others. It was also longer, much longer. After a few minutes of walking down the steps, I began to count them. At every 12 steps, there was a small landing, a turn, and another set of steps. Down. After 10 landings, I reached another door. It was unlocked and opened easily. The hinges squeaked, and the echoes died like lost things in the dark. I groped against the left wall for a light switch, and there was none. I checked the right, and the wall was equally smooth. I cast the flashlight around, but saw nothing. Nothing forward, nothing to either side, and nothing above. I snapped my fingers, listening for the echo. I may or may not have heard one. I slowly came to realise that the room into which I'd entered was enormous, cavernous, possibly the biggest room I'd ever physically experienced. I shrank back to the doorway for a moment. "This room can't be here," I said to myself. I started to think about going back, but I also started to think about wanting to know what was in there. I took a step forward, and another, until I was walking steadily into the room. I kept a steady pace, counting my steps. I looked over my shoulder every few yards, using the light from the open doorway to orient myself. I walked slowly for 100 yards, 200 yards, until I saw a dim glow ahead. The glow got faintly brighter and larger as I walked towards it. Another 100 yards, and another, and 3 more passed, until I could make out a small, dim light bulb near a door. That door was of a different type entirely. It was huge, 14 feet tall at least, and half again as wide. The surface was black metal, studded with rivets and bolts, mounted on huge hinges. Across the face of the door, engraved into the metal, were words in some strange looping script that I couldn't recognise. Every surface was carved with that script, or with strange diagrams made of splayed circle-ended lines. In the centre of the door was a large spoked wheel lock, and in the centre of that lock was a tiny keyhole. Above the keyhole was a sigil, enclosed in 3 circles. I looked behind me, and I couldn't see the light from the stairwell. I couldn't see anything at all. I held the superhero keychain to the dim light and flipped through the keys. Of course, there was one small, battered key that looked as though it might fit. I inserted it into the lock and turned it. I heard a click and a thud, and a sound from within the door like pouring pebbles or dry teeth. I pulled the key from the lock and grasped the spokes of the wheel lock. My heart was racing and sweat was dribbling into my eyes. I turned the spokes to the left, counterclockwise. Widdershins, some buried memory in my head said, and kept turning until the wheel stopped. There was another thud and a crack, and then silence. The darkness behind me no longer felt empty. In fact, it felt positively crowded, as if I had an audience watching me. I stepped back from the door and flashed my light around. Still nothing. Dry, empty floor. I turned back to the door, grasped the large cast iron handles, and pulled. Nothing. I tried harder, putting all of my weight into the pull, and at the last moment, at the end of my strength, I heard another crack, and the door groaned open on a draft of cool, stinking air. The smell was heavy, moist and musky. I had a flash memory of my mother taking me to the zoo as a child, and the smell of the cat house with the lions. At the thought of the lions, I let go of the handles and stumbled back a bit. I carefully shone my light into the yawning black crevice of the open door. I saw a short hallway that opened into a small, cramped room. I saw a filthy, rusted metal chair. I saw bones. Small bones. I saw, or heard, or smelled a form so black it seemed to suck in the light of my flashlight. I saw a black form rushing towards me, running towards me, filling the hallway, howling and laughing and speaking in a voice that sounded like mountains collapsing. I remember fangs and words that turned my bones to rusted glass. I remember feathers and a hand with too many fingers, jeweled with something unspeakable, and the smell, the stink of something long caged. I remember wings. I don't know how long I wandered in the dark, alone under hundreds of feet of rock. There was no light. There was no way to judge time. My flashlight was dead, and my cell phone, and even the small specks of luminescent paint on my cheap wristwatch were dark. There was something wrong with my right leg. It hurt, but I couldn't see enough to find out why. I kept hearing my audience, there in that cavernous room. I screamed at them. I felt one of them touch my face, and I threw my flashlight at it. It bounced and rattled and became still, somewhere that I was not. Something laughed later. I raved and screamed, but didn't throw anything else. I found the doorway after hours, or was it days of crawling. There were no lights in the stairwell. After years of climbing, I crawled into that first forgotten hallway. I sliced my fingers on the crushed remains of the light bulbs that I'd packed in my satchel. I crawled down the hallway and reached the next stairwell. I hauled myself up them and finally out into the boiler room. When I staggered out of Downing Hall, 2 full days after going in, it was into dim winter daylight and a full police presence. 5 people had been found dead on or around the campus. All had been brutally, savagely murdered. Bodies splayed open, viscera missing. The teeth marks suggested a wild animal, but the murder scenes and body positioning also displayed a certain intelligence to them. There was also the writing, carved into the flesh when it was not yet dead meat. The police wouldn't talk about the writing. The police wouldn't talk to me either, not afterwards. When they first saw me stumble out into the daylight, covered in blood, they assumed I was the perpetrator. They quickly changed their assumptions when the medics pointed out the green stick fracture, the dehydration, the concussion, and the obvious shock. The police asked me a lot of questions, and I answered as best I could. I told them about the door in the boiler room. They couldn't find it. They showed me the bare, smooth wall from where I'd crawled, dazed and broken. My tracks stopped at that wall. 2 policemen tried breaking through the wall in that spot, only to meet old brick and older earth past that. They wanted to know where the long black feathers came from, stuck to my clothes by dried blood. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The police, the medics, no one would look at me anymore. The scars on my face, the deep, gouged out writing, was not a sight that most would want to see. I was marked. Whatever I'd let out, whatever had killed and eaten 5 people, and a week later 6 more, had marked me as a friend. For more terrifying creepypasta horror stories, check out the playlist or the video on screen.